Welcome to this week's Eco Seminar class on the weekly Torah portion. This week's portion is VaYera, and I'll wait until everyone signs in. This is meant to be an interactive class, so please feel free to ask questions. Just type them in and hopefully I'll be able to see them and I'll answer them. This week's portion is called VaYera, and that word actually has multiple meanings. The most literal meaning in the parsha means that it was shown to him, to Abraham, but also it means that he will fear, which is to teach us that if somebody doesn't know something, fear comes from the unknown. Fear comes from us needing to have answers that we don't have. Then we develop something called fear. So that he will see, meaning he doesn't know yet where he's going or what's coming, and fear are tied into the same root source. I'm going to first tell some summary of the portion, so people should have a review of what the subject matters are, and then I'm going to table some questions that were asked of me for this question. Of course, if anybody has any questions, just ask. So the main themes in the parsha, and of course there's many more things, but the main themes in the parsha, it starts with Abraham receiving 3 stately guests, and it says that these are special people. He could tell by the way they were walking, and part of the reason was because they were courteous. Each one was giving honor to the other one to come in first, to go ahead first. They of course came, and Abraham received them. Their purpose was to give a blessing that Sarah would have a child, and there were a few other missions they were on, but the one specifically for Abraham was to teach that he was going to have a child, which was seemingly impossible based on their age and that they otherwise were unable to have children. Of course, it says that Sarah laughed, and then she denied laughing, and this was over the impossibility of her having a child at that age. Then it moves on to Sodom, first of all, Abraham having responsibility over Sodom because the whole country was his, and Lot, who was given this as the place for him to pasture with his animals, with his sheep. It was his inclination, and there's a whole discussion as to why Lot picked there when it was the worst part of the country. It talks about the immorality, of course, about Lot, about Sodom, and why it was immoral and what made them immoral. The Gemara, the Talmud, as I mentioned last week, emphasizes strongly when it wants to talk about something being immoral beyond measure, it talks about Sodom. And the example that the Gemara gives, which we'll come back to after, is when it comes to property, when someone does not allow another to benefit from his property, even when he's not going to lose anything, and he does not allow the second to benefit, that's considered being immoral, as the inhabitants of Sodom, before the uprising, before the angels came to turn it over as a commandment of God. So immorality is measured by how willing we are to help other people, how much we're willing to do for someone else, even if it doesn't cost us anything. Then there's escaping Sodom, Lot having to escape Sodom, and at the same time, in parallel, there's Abraham negotiating with God to try to save the city on behalf of 50, and then 45, and eventually 10 righteous people, which he couldn't find. Eventually, Abraham had to go to Egypt. There was another test of morality with the king of Egypt, of Shalom. There's the part of the story with Hagar, where Abraham is told to take a maidservant as a second wife. He has Ishmael as a son, the promise of great nations, even to Ishmael, even though Hagar was sent away by Sarah according to God's command. There's the whole part of Ishmael, like I said, the promise of great nations, the whole portion about circumcision and the covenant, and what it is to make a deal with God. There's the whole concept of outreach, that Abraham went to be a missionary, he went to be an activist, he went to teach people, and why is that important? And then there's a question of sacrifice, when Abraham was asked to bring sacrifice of his own son, and then of course it wasn't his own son, it was an animal instead. But what was that all about? So if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. I'll table in the meantime some questions that were asked of me before tonight's lesson, and I'll start elaborating on them. But of course, if anybody out there who's following has any questions, please feel free to ask. And if you watch this after it's been saved and shared on Facebook and you have questions, feel free to ask me also. One question is, what do we learn from the angel's visit? I mean, there could have been many ways how Abraham would have been given this news. God could have spoken directly to him. There could have been other signs. Why did he need 3 angels? Why did all 3 have to come to him? So one of the things we learn from here is that continuity is inevitable. Sustainability is the key. In other words, Abraham was doing his thing. Abraham discovered God and he did his part, and he would have been special enough just being who he was without going to proselytize, going to bring in students. It also was, he didn't need necessarily children if he was dedicated to teaching other people. But we're taught in many places, and Rav Nachman of Breslov makes it very clear, that the purpose of a person's life, the absolute purpose of a person's life, is to have continuity. And the only way we can perpetuate our existence in this life is through followers that follow our path. And of course, the longer they follow, and not to beat on the subject of sustainability too much, but built in the word sustainability means that it keeps on going. So regardless of the environmental subject of sustainability, the whole word of sustainability means that it's something that will go on. And for someone to be sustainable, for someone to have an everlasting impression in this world, they have to have followers. And one way to have followers is to have children if you raise them in your way and if they follow your way. Another way is to have students. And that was Abraham's mission. It wasn't enough just to have students, because there's a different kind of loyalty if someone is a child. In fact, the whole essence of Jewish tradition, and one of the reasons why, this is something quoted by a rabbi named Nathan Cardoza, who wrote a book called The Infinite Chain, about explaining why is it and how is it possible that throughout thousands of years of exile, the small number of Jews managed to survive and thrive despite everything, and still be here, and all these years later to survive in this world. And he explained this because the tradition that's special among Judaism, that is unique to Judaism, is the transmission from father to son, which we emphasize on the Pesach Seder, the Seder night of the night of Passover, when we have a commandment, we are told to teach our children on that day. The reason why that's important is because many traditions can be given over, many stories can be taught over as history, but there's something different when a father tells their son. I happen to be a child of a Holocaust survivor, and I know that the Holocaust happened not because of all the stuff that I learned in school, not because of the fact that I was at Yad Vashem, not because I met other people, not because I was in Warsaw and because I saw the things that I saw, the historical remnants. I know because my father told me, and there's nothing more convincing, because there's no reason why he would lie to me about something like that. And Jewish tradition is uniquely that, in the sense that as a whole, we have a tradition that's passed from father to son. There's no stronger testimony. Other traditions, when it's told third party, it's a question of faith. But there's a unique faith that we have when it's something given from parent to child or from father to son. And that was one of the added strengthenings that God gave to Abraham in this week's portion, in this week's Sedra, was that he would also have children. It wasn't enough that he had only students. And we'll come back to that in a few minutes. I mentioned before that Sodom is the biblical example of evil, the dark side, and how the Gemara uses it as an example of immorality, when a person simply will not share something that he has that doesn't cost him anything to share. Of course, we're talking about something that won't be diminished or won't be consumed when it's shared. And what we see there is that we have an underlying theme that, although it isn't defined specifically in individual commandments, although it is also in individual commandments, the theme, which is try to share this creation that we have, anything that we have in this world, if it's not meant to better our lives and other people's lives, and if it's not meant to be used for bettering the world, but also to be shared with other beings, then there's no point. So the purpose of Sodom is, the message of Sodom was that they went out of their way to discourage community. They went out of their way to discourage sharing. They went out of their way to discourage the moral bond and the ethical bond, the covenantal bond between people. That makes it that a person isn't able to trust. It makes it that a person isn't able to grow. It makes it that a person isn't able to enjoy what they have if they're always in fear. So the immorality of Sodom and the fact that Lot, who was Abraham's nephew or Sarah's nephew, and then Abraham's nephew, was able to fall to such a level where even though they had such abundance that they weren't able to share, was the reason why Sodom was picked. And it went from wherever it is to be literally the lowest place on earth. And part of the reason why it's the lowest place on earth is because it's the last one to receive many of the blessings, because the blessings just don't reach there anymore. Now we have a drought in the Dead Sea, where the Dead Sea is receding, the whole Dead Sea area and the Sodom area, where it just can't, it can't grow and it can't get water because the water is used up by the tributaries that come there. Now, in Parshas Noach, it talks about how Noach was a righteous man in his own generation. And then there's discussions of the fact that if he was alive in Abraham's generation, if he would have been righteous or not, if he would have been able to stand for the. It's a very good question. Was Lot worthy of being saved as he chose to live in Sodom? Obviously he was. He was worthy of being saved. He was saved. Why was he worthy of being saved is the question. This was brought up, I actually heard this answer. This was discussed on, I heard it in Shabbat in Shul. Somebody asked this question in a different context. And the reason is, Lot had a mission. He had a mission to be the forefather of King David. And although it wasn't on his own merit, it was on the merit of the fact that he, first of all, tried to save the guests, which were the angels. He didn't know who they were, but he knew that they were special guests. He tried to save them. And although he did very, very many things that were problematic, for that alone he was worth saving. There was a spark in him that was worth saving for the fact that King David, and then later after that, Mashiach, will be a descendant of him. Why? It's very hard for us to understand. But he was worthy of saving, which is why he was saved from Sodom. I'll come back to this question in a moment. I was explaining that in the time of Noach, it says, compared to Abraham, Noach might not have been saved. Now, we learn, the Kabbalah teaches us and other traditions teach us that all of our forefathers knew the whole Torah. Which means that there's an aspect that says that Abraham, in his time, knew the history, which means the Torah that was current until then, and some say even the laws that came after, in his time. So he was given some type of a heads up, or some type of a reference to the fact that he has to do something different than what Noach did. It wasn't enough for Abraham just to take care of himself. He heard and learned the fact that Noach was somewhat criticized by the fact that he didn't warn other people during the 120 years that he was building the ark. He was also criticized by the fact that he didn't do more to help other people. He didn't pray for the nations. So Abraham, what he did differently, and then of course he did this again his whole life, but especially when he went to beseech the mercy on behalf of Sodom, was that he was looking for good points. There's a famous Torah, it's a lesson 282, Reish Pei Bet, the Rav Nachman teaches about finding good points in other people. He explains, and this might have something to do with Lot also, he explains that it's not just a question of quantity, of course, and we don't know the quality of each mitzvah, but when we focus on, first of all, negative points of someone, then it illuminates them, or at least it strengthens them, and it gives them more power, and then it gives more weight to those deeds. And the same thing happens when we focus on the good points that a person has. Rav Nachman explains that when a person focuses on, looks for and finds good points in other people, and of course that's something that Abraham was trying to do his whole life, but he had a reason for it, and it's what he was trying to do when he tried to save Sodom. And by doing that, he also found the good points in Lot. It says that when we take the good points that a person has without judging the bad points, in other words, not talking about judging favorably, it's not talking about weighing one over the other, but when we emphasize the good points that a person has, in this case, let's say we talk about Lot. Let's say we talk about the fact that Lot, when he came to Abraham and he explained to the fact that there's not enough room in town for the two of them, that they have to split up, there was a certain side to that even if it might have been motivated by evil, there's a side to that Lot didn't want to steal. There's a side to that Lot wanted to be more honest and more fair, or at least to his own sheep, if not the neighbor's sheep. He didn't want there to be any dispute over the land. He wanted his own land. So the fact that that was a good point on its own, regardless of its motivation, and the fact that Abraham focused on that and emphasized that, the light of that specific good point can outshine the darkness of many evil deeds. So in the Torah that Rav Nachman explains, Torah Reish Pei Bet 242, called the Zamra, it says that when a person focuses on the good point, that good point all of a sudden becomes elevated. It all of a sudden gets more weight in, as far as value. It's the quality and not the quantity. And then by outshining the darkness, all of a sudden the darkness isn't there anymore, because a little bit of light can dispel a lot of darkness. So aside from what's destiny in being the father or the forefather to King David, even though it was through the very questionable or seemingly improper relation that he had with his daughter. When I say seemingly, obviously it was improper. There's no question that it was improper. But the fact that it happened and it was allowed to bear seed for the future generations led to Ruth, and then eventually Moab, Ruth, and then eventually King David, and then from King David, besides his dynasty, also the Mashiach, Messiah. There must be that there's a higher purpose. But besides that, we see that this little good points that Lot had, that Abraham was able to emphasize and to illuminate and to empower, were able to outshine the darkness that Lot had, because it was obviously evil that he had. He also had bad points. But Abraham's ability to focus on the good point gave them power to outshine the bad points. And obviously for that reason, in addition to all the different reasons that God has that I will never know, and none of us will ever know, it was enough, it seems, that it allowed Lot to be considered worthy, and that's why he was saved. I'm just looking at the other questions I have here. So it says, towards the end, it said that, Abraham had to do the circumcision, which was his signing a contract with God. At the time, they didn't have other mitzvahs. Besides the relevance and the significance to circumcision and why there, and how moral it is, and what place it has for today, which is not for me to judge. The reason why it was used then, again, I'm not judging about the morality. If God said to do it, there's obviously a reason, and there's many more reasons besides whatever I can rationalize. But at the time, there weren't a lot of commandments that they had. And since the only commandment that Abraham was given for himself was the test of morality and the test of how he will guard his seed and how he will raise his future generations, the one commandment that he had was in the test of morality. So he was given the circumcision was his test with which to sign a contract with God. With that, though, there came more tests, and there was the sacrifice he had to do after that with Isaac, where he had to come towards the end of the portion where he had to bring Isaac as a sacrifice, and then of course it wasn't Isaac in the end, it was the ram instead. This was traditionally, it happened on Rosh Hashanah, which is why we use the ram's horn to blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. We don't understand all the reasons why these specific tests were given, and there's many different commentaries that explain why. But if anything, it's to teach us that what we think to be the reason for something is never the reason. Abraham was told at a very ripe old age that he was going to have a son. He was promised before that he was going to have legions and generations come after him, yet he reached a ripe old age where he was unable to have children. And he accepted that. So he taught, he converted people who wanted to learn the way, he brought many students, he went and preached what he preached and taught what he taught, until finally he was explained that he was going to have children. You can only imagine how that changed his life. So he focused on his children, obviously, and he did what he could to raise Isaac, and then he was told to bring Isaac as a sacrifice. Not once did his faith waver. Not once did Abraham's faith waver in the questions and the tests that he had to do. In fact, in order to not find question, he woke up early in the morning because he was afraid that if Sarah were to see him taking his son to a sacrifice, their one and only son, she wouldn't let him, which would make sense. But nonetheless, when Abraham understood that was the right thing to do. Now, obviously this isn't being meant to be taken literally for today, that we're supposed to learn from his example and go and sacrifice children or sacrifice people. We're also not supposed to learn anything literally for today unless God were to come and tell us directly to do something. But it is meant to teach us that when a person is on a mission, and of course he has to know what the mission is. I mean, Abraham was basically the first activist. He was the first missionary, he was the first activist, he was the first person doing outreach, and his mission was to teach people about God's creation. And the reason why this was done with all of his efforts and with everything that he had is because every other way of thought at the time was to deny God, was to deny the Creator, and basically was to create a system that wasn't sustainable. Not trying to pick on the word sustainable, but it happens to be the bottom line. Every other way of life for the 20 generations from Adam until Abraham, everyone was looking for deviance. Abraham was born in a house of idol worshipping. His father was one of the leading vendors of idols. We know all the stories, we know the midrashim, we know that Abraham woke up at a young age to discover God. With that, he tested the idols, all the different stories that we know. But Abraham knew from very, very young that there's much more to it than that. And despite how much he knows, there's so much that he doesn't know. But what he does know is that the Creator is the one who created the creation for us to be part of it and not to dominate it in the sense that it's to be destroyed, which what everyone else was doing. Everyone wanted to take claim to the creation. The other kings who turned themselves into idols were all looking for more than just being a resident of this planet. They were looking to dominate way beyond what man was meant to do. And when Abraham was trying to put man into perspective and teach people, no matter how great they are, because he himself had great power. He himself was able to do things that very few people were able to do, as we saw in last week's portion when Abraham was in the war of 5 kings against 4, and he raised up the sand and it turned into arrows. Not everyone can do that. Very few people can do that. Very few people were blessed with what he was as far as the success and the wealth. He didn't need for his own gain to go around the world and to risk his life and to go from one place to another and to be nomadic. He could have managed wherever he was. But he understood and he believed that his purpose was to perpetuate the understanding of God, of the Creator, in order to understand the purpose of us in the creation. And the purpose of us in the creation, like we saw in Sodom, and with the other tests that Abraham was tested with, that no matter where he went, it wasn't easy to explain to people about morality. Instinctively, we have a survival instinct to dominate. We have a survival instinct to not trust. We have a survival instinct to be selfish on a certain level. I mean, that's the primal animal instinct. Abraham was trying to show that yes, at the same time we have the primal instinct, we also have the Spirit of God. And being that we have the Spirit of God, and that we have the mission in this world to elevate our being from just animals acting on instinct, to elevate, to overcome our instincts, and to learn how, by working together, and by overcoming our selfishness, and by overcoming our pleasure trap and our ego trap, and all the different things that make us do wrong decisions. I'll explain in a minute what those trappings are. That he was to teach us that there's a level where we can actually have more by sharing. We can have more by living in such a way where if we're not the sum of the parts, working together gives us more than the sum of the parts. And when we're fighting to protect what we have and investing or wasting money on protecting what we have rather than enjoying what we have with others, then we end up wasting a lot more. So back to the question of if Lot was worthy of being saved when he chose to live in Sodom, not for that action, but when he was brought to Sodom and then put to that test, when he saw how immoral they were, and he himself rose to the occasion, if we want to call it that he made the more moral choice and he risked his life. Yes, there's a lot of difficulties in how he was trying to do that by even offering up his daughters. But the fact that he rose to the occasion and tried to save the guests and fought for their rights, the act, which was on that level selfless, was part of what allowed him to be saved. Now, I can go on other points of other questions that people asked, but is there any questions from anyone in the not so broad audience in Facebook land? Okay, I'll continue. The stately guests. When Abraham received the guests, it says that he went to feed them, and he went to get them milk and butter, and he wanted to serve them bread, but the dough while Sarah was preparing the dough, one opinion says that she received her period, which was unusual for her, because she was, besides her age, she was barren to begin with, and then she was already way beyond the age that would be normal to have her period. But part of the blessing that was coming with the angels was that she was going to have children. It says that the bread was rendered impure. Another opinion is that they came on Passover, and because of the certain hiccup that she had while preparing the dough, it became leavened, and then because it was Passover, they weren't allowed to use it because it became unusable on Passover, so they weren't able to serve the bread. Of course, the angels didn't eat. They didn't eat. They gave only the message they were supposed to give, which was the fact that they were there to give the message that Sarah was going to have a child in a year. And because she laughed, they called him Yitzchak, because the word laugh in Hebrew is tzachak. She denied the fact that she laughed. And there's a whole discussion over that. Why would she laugh? Why would she not believe the fact that she was going to have a child? It's possible that by that point, like I said earlier in the different context of Abraham, that they were already resolved in the fact, it would seem that they were already resolved to the fact that they weren't going to have children, which is why she instructed Abraham to take her maidservant as a wife. It's also possible that very simply they already had their plate full. They were doing what they were doing as far as teaching and spreading the word full time. One might think that it's a deviation from their mission to all of a sudden be given a gift which comes with distractions. But besides the fact that we don't always know, from this particular portion we learn that trying to understand God's will or the ineffable plan or the deeper reasons that are beyond human comprehension is a waste of time. We also learn that change is inevitable. And since change is inevitable, we have to embrace change. Not just embrace change, but we have to try to, in not denying change, there's an option we have to participate in guiding it and mentoring, fostering it into the direction that we want it to go. So part of the laugh, one might think that it was a nervous laugh or a reaction, but I think as a human being, which I can't relate exactly to what Sarah was going through, obviously, but as a human being, knowing what it's like where plans seem to change on a last minute's notice, and when things seem to be clearly going in a particular direction, one has to be ready in this world now more than ever for change, because it's inevitable. And like I said before, if we embrace change, then we can do more with it, and being less resistant means we can be part of the change as opposed to trying to fight it. I've mentioned in other places that there's something called the Aikido School of Business or the Aikido School of Life. There's a way to try to approach things by taking the energy that comes against you and using it to your own advantage. What I mean by that is, Abraham could have fought at any time. He could have even discussed or argued with God like he did in the case of destroying Sodom. Why of all things did he pick that time to argue with God when he could have argued with God any of the other times? It would have maybe been just like he argued with God to save 50 people if there might be righteous people in Sodom. Could have argued to save his one son who was clearly righteous and also defined to be his heir. He could have argued. But he never did anything self-serving, Abraham. Everything that he did was already as a leader of a generation, as a leader of the people. For the latecomers who came into the class, this is a weekly class that I'm giving on behalf of Jewish Eco Seminars. And this is the weekly Torah class that I'm giving. It's meant to be interactive. Originally it was in a class with other people where people could ask questions. So if you're tuning in late, please feel free to ask any questions. I'm happy to answer. Negotiations with God. What's that all about? That we see that Abraham was able to negotiate with God. We see it later. We see it with Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, that when he came to be the leader of the nation, he argued quite often with God. And this is something that when we see that Abraham must have learned from, if you want to call it that, Noah's mistakes. When Noah didn't fight for the people, when Noah didn't try to argue with God for the rest of the people or try to help them, these are two of the points that Abraham learned from, where he went, first of all, to argue on behalf of the people. Specifically on Sodom, because Sodom was part of his country. So even though he wasn't the person who raised the people to be immoral, he was responsible for the fact that they were his inhabitants. The fact that God gave him to inherit all of Israel, and these were inhabitants of the land, he had a responsibility towards them. And he learned that, and when some commentaries say that's how he corrected or learned from the mistakes of Noah, and he repaired that, which is why in hindsight we can say that if Noah would have been in Abraham's generation, he would have been considered righteous. But of course, Abraham learned from Noah being 10 generations later, and also receiving whatever oral tradition he did about the Torah, that he had a, I don't want to say unfair advantage, but he had the advantage of hindsight and of history to learn from. Yishmael, Hagar and Yishmael. It's not easy to understand Yishmael's place and the reason why God supported Yishmael, knowing the difficulties he was going to be for Yitzchak, for Isaac, for the following generations after that, until today. Yishmael literally means Yishmael, that God heard his voice. We're told that the last exile, we're in the 4th exile now, we're told that there's going to be a 5th exile, and the 5th exile, although it should be a short one, is called the exile of Yishmael. Some opinions say we're already in that, and it's the exile of the children of Yishmael who will dominate the world. And like I said, some people say it's already happening where they're dominating the world, or at least their influence is dominating the world, and of course their influence or their impositions are felt in Israel. And the Yishmael means that they will cause such unrest among the rest of the people, or difficulties among the rest of the people, Ad Yishmael b'Yashem, that the rest of the people will call out, will cry out to God under duress from the impositions or from the difficulties, the hardships of Yishmael, that God will hear their crying and save them. Now, what does that mean? How? Yes, we're trying to stay safe. Thank you. It's I'll respond to that message on a personal message, but yes, thank you. We're staying safe. It's exactly on this topic. Yishmael. Yishmael, of course, we say is the father of Islam and the Arabian nations. There's the geography of Arabia. There's also the religion of Islam. And Yishmael traditionally is the father of both. And the idea of Yishmael is that there is this judgment that's waiting for us, all of us, and it's there to keep us in check. That if we deviate too far, that they will bring us the pain that will make us wake up and repent our ways. And if not repent our ways, at least feel the exile or the imposition of the imperfection. Not everybody feels the exile. The Jewish people feel the exile. The rest of the world feels that we're not yet redeemed. And until we're redeemed, we have to feel that. And unfortunately, part of the problem that we've arrived at is what we call the disease of affluence. We've somehow managed, despite the hardships that we've been in the thousands of years of exile, however you want to calculate it, some we've gotten used to it. We've managed to find, we have a survival instinct where we manage to find the best, even in the worst circumstances, or whether it's because we're distracted, however we cope. We have many different coping mechanisms. But the idea behind Ishmael is that we're not supposed to find coping mechanisms. We're supposed to not be happy with the fact that we're in this situation. We're supposed to ask from the Creator to correct it. The problem is when we become complacent and we don't ask for it to be changed, there's no reason for him to change. So back to the idea that we discussed earlier about negotiating with God, and something we learned later from Moses, this was one of his main things, that he pleaded with God on behalf of the Jewish people, on behalf of the Hebrews. It wasn't the Jewish people, it was the entire the Hebrew nation, which later gave birth to all the other religions in the world, which of course started with Abraham. But the idea was they were supposed to negotiate with God. If we don't negotiate with God, it means we don't believe that He's there. It means we don't believe that either there is a Creator or we don't believe that He's still running the show. The idea of negotiating with God means that we accept the fact that He's still in control, whatever that means for everyone. I'm not trying to preach religion here, although this is a Torah class, but I am explaining that all of us recognize that there's a higher power. By now we realize that there's effects, there's actions that affect everyone, that our actions affect people on the other side of the world, our actions affect people beyond this world, it affects animals at the bottom of the sea, it affects things in space. Our actions, we have what's called the butterfly effect. And of course our actions also affect future generations, because as we know, it's been brought to our attention, whoever is a parent or grandparent, that the future generations are at risk based on our actions, whether we were knowing or not. So the point of negotiating with God is we're supposed to recognize that our deeds, first of all, there's repercussions to the things that we do, and that there's a higher power, whatever you want to give, whatever name you want to give to Him. And believing that there's a higher power, even if it's the collective consciousness, however you want to call it, negotiating with it, or at least believing that our intentions can manifest change, is what's meant by negotiating. In other words, let's put it simple and put it into the words of prayer. If people believe that there's a Creator, then it's obvious what it means. It means that we're supplicating the one who's in control and asking Him, believing that there's a higher power, believing that someone's in control, simply asking Him, because if we don't, then why should we expect anything to change? If it's the collective consciousness, which means that we believe that we're part of the collective energy of all the human beings, which by the way isn't a contradiction to the Jewish approach, which isn't a contradiction to the approach of Judaism and prayer. It's just that it depends what terminology and definitions you put on it. But the collective consciousness is the fact that all of us are connected. We're all connected by the fact that, first of all, we're all created by the same Creator. The sparks of holiness, or the spark of life, our soul, our spirit, whatever name you want to give it, was given to us by Him as an extension of Him. Meaning, in this world, what we have, even though we're individuals in this world, we're really appendages of this one creation of God. Appendage doesn't sound so great, but what it means is that although we seem to be different and we seem to be acting as independent beings, it's kind of like the different fingers we have on our hands. Although we have 10 fingers, most of us have 10 fingers, 5 on each hand and 5 toes on each foot, and they operate independently through the instruction of our brain to our limbs. We're part of one whole. So yes, there's one finger will feel pain if you poke it, and it might not hurt another finger if you poke a finger on your right hand. It might not hurt the finger on your left hand, but it affects us all as one. And eventually it would affect the finger on the left hand also. So the idea of negotiating with God is recognizing that, first of all, our actions have impact, but also that we're not alone. And being that we're not alone, it means that we have to connect. We connect through expressing our will. An expression of our will is prayer, and the more direct and more overt and frontally that we pray, meaning the more we have clear direction and focus and language of communication to the source of creation, the more effect it can have. Now, what method you use, what language you use, what terminology you use, if anybody wants to discuss that, first of all, feel free to ask now. If you want to ask that in a separate place, feel free to ask. According to Jewish tradition, there's two main categories of prayer. There's the organized prayer that is done, it's been put into prayer books, but it's pretty much a set text and set times in the day when it's done, and communally or not, but it's fairly set. And then of course there's places where people can add their own private prayers, and there's personal prayer or communication, which some people call it meditation, and there's an element of that also. But it's a form of communicating our personal feelings and will and intention directly to the Creator outside of the structure of organized prayer or scheduled prayer. Now, the importance is maintaining the relationship. If we don't believe we have a relationship, then we wouldn't believe that our requests can be responded to. If we believe the relationship that we have in the context of where we're holding right now in the weekly portion, which means week 1, meaning week 1 in the portions of the Torah portions, God created Adam, and 10 generations later was the second portion. He created Noach was born, and he was the next follower in the chain after 10 generations. 10 generations later was Abraham, and that's where we're holding now. So it was 20 generations that man reached to the point of Abraham where he had to rediscover that God existed. It only took 20 generations. 20 generations of living through all sorts of interesting events, the creation of the world, the destruction of the world as they knew it, the repopulation of the world, and many other things that happened in between. But the whole point was to test, to challenge, and to establish the relationship. Who wants to have a relationship with God? Now, most of the people decided to use whatever powers they had, and I don't mean mystical powers, although there's that also, but to use the powers they had of speech, of prayer, of whatever they had, to challenge God. For some reason, once they were given the ability, regardless of where it came from, they decided to challenge it as if they would be free after that and not have any accountability. Part of acknowledging the fact that there is a higher power is accountability. And part of that accountability is being responsible for our actions. And part of being responsible for our actions is knowing how to live in this world without leaving harm, and to try to leave a productive and a prosperous existence in this world, where we leave more good behind than bad. Now, I've mentioned this in the last few weeks, and I'm going to mention it again because some people are tuning in for the first time, that we're in a very unique time in history now. We're in a unique time in history now because I believe, and I don't want to say prove it, but I could argue that for the first time in history we have free will, which means that everything that's happened in the past has been to bring us till today, obviously, but there was never really an opportunity in the past, based on the lack of communication, the lack of technology, the lack of peace of mind, the lack of freedom, for people to actually, first of all, have the information necessary to make a free choice based on the right amount of information. And so people didn't have the access to information, they didn't have the freedom of the peace of mind to decide, or the technology with which to do something about it, to act on it. So I believe that for the first time in history, we're in a generation where we have a free will, where we have the opportunity to actually make rational choice based on seemingly equal options, and to choose good over bad. And there's a way to see that, there's a way to measure that, there's a way to not have to be on the fence. Like I mentioned before in a previous class, there's a very famous passage in the Talmud where it says that Mashiach, the Messiah, will only come when there's a generation is either fully full of merit or fully in the wrong way. In other words, desperate God will be to save the planet. It'll have to wipe out the evil people, so the nation will be all evil. And someone once asked a teacher by the name of Rabbi Amnon Yitzchak, who does a lot of outreach, and almost only in Hebrew, but he does it all over the world, to teach people who didn't have the proper opportunity to learn Torah properly. And they asked him, how is it possible? How is it possible when people at the same time, there's entire generations of people, entire communities of people coming back to faith, this faith, that faith, coming back to God, to being observant. At the same time, there's many people for different reasons that are challenged to the point where they're going off the path and they're leaving religion. So you see that it's constantly churning. How is it ever going to be that there will be a generation that everyone is either on the side of merit or everyone's on the side of liability? So Rav Amnon Yitzchak answered, he said, it's not that it has to be 100% here or 100% there. It's a misunderstanding of the passage. He says it's a generation where nobody's on the fence. That from the generation, everyone will either be on this side or on that side. And that's a time that's probably for the first time ever now, because it's the first time ever in history that we have access to so much information, and with filters that are available to actually sort that information and get answers, and not just get 60 million wrong answers every time we do a search. For the first time ever, we have a chance, if we spend the energy and the time and the efforts to research, we can come to an answer that should bring us to one of two sides of the fence. In other words, it's either a person's either part of the solution or part of the problem today. There's very few people that are innocent bystanders or just observers. Inaction is also action, because everyone has to make decisions when they consume fuel or heat their homes, when they buy food or produce food, when they have waste. People have to make decisions. And today we understand that every decision we make, the more garbage we have, it has to go somewhere. The more fuel or fossil fuel or carbon that we consume or produce, it has an impact. When we farm in this way, it affects certain people. When we farm in another way, it affects people differently. If we don't farm, our actions have a big difference. I can explain this all now, but I'm going to leave it for the point of understanding that we're at a unique time in history now, where our children and our children's children, their future depends on what decisions we make today. And it's not just a question of who we vote for, although there's elections seemingly all the time, all over the place, but there's federal elections in the United States coming up, there were elections recently in Canada, and there's ongoing elections in Israel, because although we've had a few elections already, we can't seem to decide on a prime minister. And I think that's all good. There's a reason why the elections are so close. Even the elections in Canada were so close that it shows that no one really, there is no proper leadership. It's very sad. Sad because the issues should be obvious. There's a problem today. That there's still hungry people today. There's still homeless people. There's still jobless people. There's still people below the poverty line. And that makes no sense. It makes no sense when there's billionaires and trillionaires out there where they have enough money, each individual person of those people, enough money to solve the problems of the whole world, and they'll never miss the amount of money they need to spend doing it. It doesn't cost a lot of money today to fix the world. It costs a lot of money to fight over what decisions to use. It costs a lot of money to wage war. It costs a lot of money to protect ourselves against fear and hatred that is produced by the same wars that are manufactured by governments. I propose that the people demand, because the solutions are available. If I would be saying something that would lead to anarchy or to chaos or to some other kind of unrest, I wouldn't say it. But there are actually options available that are cheaper than doing anything else that's being done today. More money is being spent on running elections than needed to solve all the world crises. I know that sounds like exaggerations, but I can back up what I'm saying. If things are done properly and efficiently and effectively, and with the intention of helping the masses, every government has enough resources between unused land to grow food, between unused labor to cultivate that food, and then to turn that into meals. In other words, to grow whole food, plant-based, organic plants and unprocessed plants. And then there's enough unemployed people, or even employed people, that are willing to dedicate the time to manufacture that, to produce that into edible food of all calibers and to deliver it. And there is no justification anymore for homelessness, there's no justification anymore for poverty, there's no justification for any of those things, because like I said, more money is being wasted on denying the poor people of a fair chance than what it takes to feed everyone. And the moment that a government starts focusing on taking care of their people, again, which means providing food, providing shelter, and providing work, there'll be no more illness, there'll be no more poverty, there'll be no more issues that need to be fought over. And I'm imploring on everyone, before you spend your next dollar, before you make your next vote, before you choose anything, choose properly. Think about the choice you're making. Think about the implications you're making. Think about whether you're going to use a straw. Think about whether you're going to use disposables. Think about whether you're going to throw out your garbage or whether you're going to sort your garbage and recycle more, or you're going to reuse more, or you're going to reduce more, or you're going to compost the organics. There's so many ways that we can reduce our impact. I'll give a few pointers right now. When it comes very simply to waste, people should have very, very little garbage nowadays. There's no justification for having a lot of garbage. People should not be buying whatever they're buying in disposable packaging. We should be using reusable packaging, and there are places that sell in bulk. Yes, it takes an adjustment, but it's worth it. Things that we can't use again, we can recycle, we can repurpose. Organic waste, first of all garbage should be separated. It should be separated so that when it goes to the next phase, it can actually be used, because for every individual material, there is a purpose, there are people that use it, there is what to do with it. We have to improve recycling, we have to improve reduction of waste, we have to improve on composting. Besides that, we have to stop buying unnecessarily. You have to stop spending money and encouraging manufacturing. For every boat that comes from China that brings us goods that we're barely going to use, should go back with materials that we've saved and separated and sent to China, so they should mine through our garbage, which they're doing anyways in China. When it comes to food, we should not be buying processed food. Processed food is the number one leading cause of death in the Western world. 14 out of the 15 reasons why people are dying in the Western world are caused by food, and it's self-inflicted. In case you're wondering what the 15th is, it's accidents. There's no diseases that are killing people that aren't connected to food, one way or another, either preventable or curable by food. So we need to be producing and eating locally grown whole foods. What that means, it's a separate class, but basically whole foods, for anyone who's tuning in late or hasn't listened to me speak before, whole foods come in one of 5 groups. There's fruits, vegetables, grains, legumes, and the 5th group is nuts and seeds. The closest we can get to the original form, I'm not saying it has to be eaten raw, but they should be whole foods. In other words, nothing should be taken out, and almost nothing should be added unless it's another whole food. Whole foods are by definition from plants. They by definition contain fiber. That's the whole part of them. The processed food, they by definition take away the fiber and they add chemicals. If there's things on the label that you don't understand, don't buy it. If there's things on the label that don't fit into the 5 food groups that I mentioned before, don't buy them. We have to try to avoid adding processed oil or any kind of oil, salt or sugar. I can explain why in another class. But all these are what diminish the value of our food, and they set our body into such imbalance that it can't function properly. Sugar is wonderful and it's necessary as long as we get it within the food that we're eating, meaning from fruits mostly. Date sugar is the healthiest sugar because it comes with the fiber of the plant. Otherwise, all sugar should be only ingested with the fruit that it comes in. Oil is also very important. It's mandatory for the brain, but it's only digestible for the system properly when it's eaten in the foods that it comes in, whether they're nuts or whether they're seeds, whether it's olives or avocados, whether it's coconuts. All of those oils are wonderful when they come with the food that they're in. In other words, coconut oil is great when it comes with coconuts. Olive oil is great when it comes in the olives. And avocado oil is great when it comes with avocados. So yes, eat avocados, eat coconuts, eat olives. And salt. Salt is something that, first of all, if you're going to add it at the table as a last-minute seasoning to your own dish that's produced properly, it's not the end of the world. But there's so much salt that is put into all processed food that it's impossible not to be poisoned and also not to become addicted to the food. I'm going to come back for a moment to the trappings that I mentioned earlier. All the things I'm telling you and all the things I'm mentioning that I repeat time after time after time. Hi Yaakov. נעים מאוד. תודה שהתחברת. סליחה על השיר באנגלית. All the things that we see that have happened through those 20 generations that led from Adam to Abraham and have led from those generations till today is simply defined as the disease of affluence. You can call it imperialism, you can call it a lot of different things, but it's generically labeled the disease of affluence, meaning that ever since the beginning of time, but More recently, we can see it from modern art since the 1400s, the 1500s, when it was shown as a sign of wealth and prosperity to be fat. In other words, to overeat. And that was always done in conjunction with eating poorly, which usually meant with eating meat. Now, the reason why it's called the disease of affluence is because only rich people can afford to get sick. Only rich people can afford doctors. Only rich people can afford time off from work. Only rich people can afford to die, because their money or their family or whoever else will take care of whoever they leave behind. So there's this mentality that it's kind of tied into the American freedom of liberties, which is kind of indicative of their right to fight for the right to make stupid decisions. Forgive me for saying that. But freedom is associated with the right to make bad decisions for some reason. Somehow it's evolved or devolved to that freedom is the right to do something stupid. If someone tells me that I shouldn't do something because it's wrong, I should have the right to do something wrong, because that shows my right of freedom. Now, it's called the disease of affluence because only rich people could afford these things, like I said before. Sorry. And it's led to the point where part of that is that there's two inherent traps, which is why I mentioned trappings before, two inherent traps that come with the disease of affluence. One of them is called the ego trap, and there's another trap called the pleasure trap. The pleasure trap is something that we're psychologically wired somehow to believe that these things that are going to benefit us will benefit us more than they actually do. In other words, the pleasure trap is that we get lured into believing that if we do this act or eat a certain food, in the case that I'm talking about, despite the fact that it's apparent that it's bad for us, the pleasure is so good that it's worth it. Now you can think about that for a moment. It sounds really childish. It sounds like something that as parents we would tell our children, to be smarter than that, but we ourselves unfortunately aren't smart enough to do that. Now, part of that is chemical. Pleasure is a chemical thing. There's endorphins and other kind of hormones and chemicals released in the body when we feel pleasure. And the food industry and many other industries that were produced to hook us into pleasure, whether it's drugs or alcohol or food, are meant to trigger that. So part of the problem with the disease of affluence and the pleasure trap is that once we get caught on the hook, it's very hard to break free, because the level of pleasure that we're used to, because of the chemicals and other enhancements, hormones or chemicals that are in the food, make it impossible to break free. But we have to learn and understand and remind ourselves that it's really the chemicals, and there's so much bad that it's doing for us that no matter what short-term pleasure we think that it's giving, it's not worth it. When I was a child, I had a dentist who used to hand out candies. And one time when I went to get a filling, I didn't realize the laughing gas that he was using was meant to diminish the pain. I didn't like the smell, so I didn't breathe the laughing gas, and it was very painful, but I was too tough to admit that it was painful. And when I left the doctor's office, his nurse gave me a lollipop because I was a good boy and because I behaved myself. Well, I learned very quickly after that candies are the leading source of getting cavities. Of course, you have to brush your teeth, but if you didn't have the candy, you'd have to brush your teeth a little bit less. And I realized what a sadist this doctor was. Now, of course, I could have just breathed the laughing gas, which is most people do. But to me, I realized from that point that there's no matter how sweet the candy is, it's never going to be worth the pain that I have to endure when I went to the doctor's office. And from that time on, I never was a fan of candies. In other words, there's a point where we learn as intelligent, sentient beings, as we grow older and more intelligent, hopefully, we learn to realize that there's a time that no matter how much we think we're enjoying, that it's not worth it. So that's the pleasure trap. It doesn't take long for us to get off of the trappings of the pleasure trap, besides the fact that there's tremendous amount of options that are available that are better. It's just that not chemically addictive, but better. And it takes somewhere between 21 to 30 days to detoxify from the chemicals, to go through rehab so that we're not addicted. The other issue I said before is the ego trap, which is a bigger deal. The ego trap is something where, very simply, it's hard to wake up one day and admit that you're wrong. Especially when you realize how bad the decisions you were making until now were. Now, if someone's been to or through a 12-step program, for whatever reason, for whatever addiction, they go through these things. But if you haven't been, maybe it's time, because I believe that most issues today that are facing people are this addiction, and there should be 12-step, there should be we have a Facebook group called Omnivores Anonymous, and it was meant to lead to support groups for people trying to come off of the addiction of food. But there's a specific addiction of on the guilt for the ego trap, where it doesn't allow a person to admit that they're wrong. When a person's whole image, their whole personality is how they're known, and they're known based on how they portray themselves, and they portray themselves based on their lifestyle, to one day come and change your lifestyle, it means you're coming to deny everything that you were until now. And you're also admitting that you've made mistakes. Now that's, in today's day, when, especially in North America, or especially in the United States, when litigation is one of the greatest competitive sports in the United States, is probably litigation, people are afraid to admit liability. But today it's impossible to deny it. It's impossible to deny the information. So it's a question of people are going to get out in front of it, or if they're going to wait to be accused of something. But the ego trap is probably the number one biggest issue. I can tell you for a fact that being the one who recognizes their mistakes and coming out in front of it, and then being the ambassador for the truth, will always be the right choice, and will always give you more gratification than one day being caught in your lies where you have nowhere to escape to. When I was already semi-retired for reasons beyond my control, my granddaughter came and asked me, why is it that you're not doing more for the environment? Like, what about our future? You might be set for yours. It might not happen within your lifetime, but if you're not doing more, it means you don't care about my future, my granddaughter told me. Well, that's when I realized that, ego or not, she was right. Now, I got out in front of it, and luckily it was only that level of ego, but it's going to come. I can tell you firsthand that a part of the reason why there's such a shift in the world and their awareness of the sustainability issues, besides all the activists, which are no less of the point, were very simply the major corporations being behind the scenes dealt a deck that showed them their liability, that showed them what's going to happen if they don't get in front of it. And although, yes, they were stuck for the longest time in the ego trap, they realized that there's no avoiding it anymore. There's no escaping the fact that the truth is out. So, I want this to be very clear. There's no escaping the fact that the truth is out. It's kind of like being in Sodom when there's the siren is going off saying, we're going to nuke Sodom. Now you have a choice. Either repent, give up your evil ways, or be wiped out. Oh, I see I'm already past the time. Okay, you get the message. Thank you for tuning in. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to either send them in or to private message me or comment on this. Thank you for watching. Next week's class will be given by Rabbi Yonatan Nerel. I'm not sure the location, but I think it will be offline as well, and there will also be Facebook Live. If anybody is interested in my classes, in addition to Rabbi Nerel's, please let me know. We can schedule something else, or I can continue to do this and to post them. We are offering 5 styles of classes in our nutrition center, which is officially opening again this week in Jerusalem. We're giving classes on ethics from a spiritual or religious point of view, which is done in this context from a Torah point of view. We're giving the moral and ethical point of view from other religions and from the general ethics of just being good, regardless of what label you want to put on it. No offense to anybody. We're giving the economical reasons why it makes more sense to be sustainable. That's a separate set of courses. We're giving the social reasons, and there's a few other reasons. Basically, we give classes in 5 different subjects: the economical, the moral, the scientific reasons, which includes health, and the ethical reasons. So thank you for tuning in. It was a pleasure to be here, and hopefully you all got something out of this. Have a great evening, and all the best.